In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a group of kids was having the time of their lives. The laughter and the sound of a basketball bouncing on the pavement filled the air, mingling with the gentle hum of lawnmowers and the occasional car passing by. The kids, mostly aged between 10 and 12, were enjoying a friendly game of basketball on a court they considered their own. They were the kind of kids who loved spending time outdoors, cherishing the simple joys of life and not worrying about much else. Across the street, however, something was brewing. Mr. Anderson, a man in his 50s who had lived in the neighborhood for years, was sitting on his front porch. His house, somewhat worn and needing a fresh coat of paint, seemed to blend into the backdrop of the tranquil street. No one really paid much attention to him. He wasn't the type to socialize or involve himself in the community. On this particular afternoon, though, something about the kids grated on him. Perhaps it was the noise, or maybe it was the fact that they didn't seem to belong in the neighborhood. Or perhaps it was simply the way they were laughing and having fun without a care in the world while he sat alone on his porch. Whatever the reason, he didn't like it. The laughter, the sound of the ball bouncing on the asphalt, the way the kids appeared so carefree, it all rubbed him the wrong way. Without a second thought, Mr. Anderson picked up his phone and dialed the police. He reported that there were suspicious kids causing a disturbance in the neighborhood. He didn't know who they were, nor did he care. All he wanted was for them to leave and stop making noise. After making the call and hanging up, he went back inside his house, assuming the problem would be resolved quickly. He had no idea that his decision was about to set off a chain of events that would completely alter everything. Within minutes, the unmistakable sound of sirens could be heard approaching the block. The kids, still engrossed in their game, didn't hear them at first. They were absorbed in their world, making jokes, trying to sink shots, and simply enjoying their Saturday afternoon. But as the sirens grew louder, they started to look around, confused. A police car turned the corner, followed by another one. The flashing lights illuminated the street, casting an eerie glow against the walls of nearby houses. The officers stepped out of their cars, their expressions unreadable, and approached the group of kids. The air immediately felt tense. The kids froze, unsure of what was happening or why the police were there. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were just playing basketball and having fun. The officers began asking questions. "What are you kids doing here? Do you live around here? Do you have permission to use this court?" The kids, now nervous and unsure of how to respond, gave their names and explained they were just out playing with no intention of causing any trouble. The questions came fast and sharp. One officer pulled out a notebook and started jotting down notes while the other kept looking around, almost as if they were expecting to find something wrong. The tension was mounting. None of the kids had ever been in a situation like this before. They looked at each other, wide-eyed, hoping this was some kind of misunderstanding. But the officers weren't backing down. They continued their questioning, treating the kids almost like suspects. It wasn't long before another car pulled up. It wasn't a police car. It was a black sedan. Out stepped a woman dressed in a professional outfit. She walked up the driveway of Mr. Anderson's house, her high heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her eyes scanned the street quickly before locking onto the scene unfolding by the basketball court. She had a stern look on her face, and that's when Mr. Anderson noticed her too. His face turned pale as he saw her approach. He knew who she was. She was his daughter, Emily, a social worker who fought for the rights of children and worked to ensure that things like this didn't happen. She had been trying to reach out to her father, but he had ignored her calls. Now, there she was standing on the same street, about to witness something that would shake him to his core. Emily's eyes locked with Mr. Anderson's for a brief moment, without saying a word. Then, she turned toward the kids, her face softening with a look of concern. She had no idea what was going on, but she knew something wasn't right. She had been busy all morning with her work, but now, in front of her father's house, she could see what had just transpired, and she wasn't happy about it. Emily didn't waste any time. She walked straight toward her father, her heels clicking sharply with each step. Her expression was hard to read, but the anger in her eyes was clear. Mr. Anderson, still standing on his porch, suddenly felt a tight knot form in his stomach. He could already sense that something was wrong. Emily stopped in front of him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice cold, barely above a whisper. Mr. Anderson tried to speak, but Emily cut him off before he could even get a word out. I don't know what your problem is with those kids, but I'm about to find out. The words hit Mr. Anderson like a slap in the face. He was speechless, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to say. But he knew he couldn't lie to her, especially not after what he'd just done. He had been hoping she wouldn't find out, hoping this would all blow over, but now, here she was, standing in front of him, and the weight of what he had done hit him all at once. He didn't know how to explain himself. The kids had annoyed him, sure, but that was no excuse for what he'd done. He never thought calling the police would lead to this. Emily's face was a mixture of disbelief and anger. You called the cops on them? On kids who were just playing basketball, she asked, her voice rising now, drawing the attention of the officers who were still standing by the group of kids, unsure of how to handle the situation. Do you even realize what that could have done to them? What if they'd been treated differently? What if something worse had happened? Mr. Anderson opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He was caught. His own daughter, the one person who could see through him, was confronting him about his actions. The reality of it all hit him harder than anything he'd felt in a long time. He had spent so many years trying to bury the person he was, trying to ignore the mistakes he'd made, but now they were staring him in the face, and there was no running away from it. Emily didn't wait for an answer. Instead, she turned to face the officers who had been questioning the kids. She walked over to them, speaking quickly and firmly. These kids are innocent. They were doing nothing wrong. You don't need to be here. This was a mistake. Her tone was unwavering, and the officers looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable. Before long, one of them slowly nodded. As the situation started to settle, Mr. Anderson stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The events were spiraling out of his control, and he could feel the walls closing in. He had no idea what his daughter would do next, but he knew he had just made a mistake. The worst part was that he knew he deserved whatever was coming his way. Emily's words hit harder than anything Mr. Anderson had expected. As she spoke to the officers, his heart sank deeper with each passing second. His world felt like it was crumbling around him. He had hoped for so long that he could keep the truth hidden, that he could continue living his life without facing the consequences of his actions. But now his own daughter was standing up for those kids, and the shame was unbearable. The officers, realizing they were standing on shaky ground, began to back off. They nodded at Emily, mumbling apologies as they turned to leave. The kids, still standing on the court, were visibly confused but relieved. They had no idea what had just happened or why the officers were leaving, but they were grateful. The situation seemed to be calming down as the officers drove away. Emily turned back toward her father, her eyes narrowing. She had one last thing to say before she was done with him. You've got to understand something, Dad, she said, her voice now tinged with frustration and hurt. What you just did wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. You saw a group of kids, and for some reason, you thought the worst of them. And then you did something that could have ruined their lives. She took a deep breath, trying to hold back her emotions. You don't get to play the victim here, and you don't get to ignore this. Mr. Anderson felt the weight of her words settle over him. His throat tightened as guilt flooded his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Emily had always been the strong one, the one who fought for what was right, who stood up for others. And now, here she was standing before him, holding him accountable for his actions. He couldn't argue with her. There was no excuse for what he had done. He was wrong, and deep down he knew it. Emily took one last look at him before turning to walk toward the kids. As she got closer, she knelt down to their level, offering them a reassuring smile. You guys are okay. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not, she said gently. The kids nodded, still processing what had just happened. Some of them looked relieved, while others seemed more puzzled than ever, trying to figure out why they had been treated like criminals in the first place. Emily's voice softened as she continued. Enjoy your game, and don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong here. She stood up and turned back to face her father, her expression hardening once more. I'm done here, she said quietly, but you and I are going to have a long talk when I get back to the office. With that, Emily walked away, leaving Mr. Anderson standing on his porch, frozen in place, feeling the full weight of his daughter's disappointment hanging over him. The silence that followed Emily's departure was deafening. Mr. Anderson stood there, staring at the empty street, unable to move or speak. He could still hear the distant sound of the basketball bouncing on the court, a stark contrast to the tension that gripped him. His hands were trembling, and he felt a tightness in his chest, as though the weight of everything he had done was slowly suffocating him. He had hoped for just a moment that the situation would pass, that Emily would leave and forget about the confrontation. But deep down, he knew that wasn't going to happen. The worst part was that he had no one to blame but himself. The kids, innocent and full of life, had done nothing wrong. They were just trying to enjoy a simple game, something every child should be able to do without fear. But because of his own biases, his own assumptions, they had been dragged into a situation they never should have been part of. And Emily, his daughter, the one person who would never let him get away with such ignorance, had seen right through him. Mr. Anderson slowly sank into a chair on his porch, staring at the ground. He tried to replay the events in his mind, but it all felt blurry now. The anger he had felt earlier, the impulse to call the police, it all seemed so trivial in hindsight. What had he been thinking? The more he thought about it, the worse he felt. He had been so quick to judge, so willing to take drastic action over something so small. Mr. Anderson slowly sank into a chair on his porch, staring at the ground. He tried to replay the events in his mind, but it all felt blurry now. The anger he had felt earlier, the impulse to call the police, it all seemed so trivial in hindsight. What had he been thinking? The more he thought about it, the worse he felt. He had been so quick to judge, so willing to take drastic action over something so small. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, keeping everyone at arm's length, and now those walls were coming down one brick at a time. Meanwhile, across the street, the kids had gone back to their game, but the mood had shifted. There was a quietness in the air now, a tension that hadn't been there before. They were all still processing what had happened. Some of them whispered to each other, trying to make sense of it, while others kept shooting hoops, too nervous to speak. The question that hung over them wasn't about the game anymore. It was about the fact that they had been treated like criminals for no reason at all. None of them had ever been in a situation like this. They had no idea why the police had shown up or why they had been questioned like that, but they could feel the weight of it. They were just kids, and all they wanted to do was play. And for a brief moment, as they glanced over at Mr. Anderson's house, they couldn't help but wonder what they had done to deserve this. As Mr. Anderson sat on his porch, the reality of his actions began to sink in heavier with each passing second. He couldn't shake the image of Emily's face when she confronted him. He had seen that look before many times. It was the look of someone who knew the truth, someone who wasn't afraid to speak it, and now it was aimed squarely at him. He had no idea how he was going to fix this, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just pretend it never happened. The evening crept in slowly, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. Mr. Anderson sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He tried to distract himself by flipping through the newspaper, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the events of the day. He could still see the kids' faces, confused and scared, and he could hear Emily's voice, sharp and disappointed, cutting through the air like a blade. He felt as though everything he had built his life around, his comfort, his solitude, his sense of control, was slipping through his fingers. He heard a car pull up in the driveway. Emily was back. She had said she would be, and she didn't keep promises lightly. As soon as the door opened, Mr. Anderson felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from the hours of sitting in the same spot, thinking about everything he had done wrong. When Emily walked into the kitchen, her face was calm, but there was an intensity in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. "Dad," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that made his heart race. "We need to talk." She didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she took a seat across from him at the table, her gaze never leaving his. The silence between them felt heavy, more uncomfortable than any conversation they had ever had before. Mr. Anderson opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He was trying to find an explanation, some way to make what he had done seem less unforgivable, but he knew deep down that no explanation could fix what had happened. He had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. Emily took a deep breath, then spoke, her voice firm but tinged with hurt. You don't get it, do you? What you did today wasn't just a bad call. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. You put those kids in danger, Dad. You treated them like criminals for no reason, and worse, you hurt me. You hurt me in a way I never thought you would. You spent your whole life teaching me that we stand up for what's right, that we don't judge people based on their appearance or where they come from. And today, you did the exact opposite. Mr. Anderson's chest tightened as he listened to his daughter's words. He wanted to say something to explain himself, but the guilt was overwhelming. He had never seen Emily so angry, so disappointed. She was the one person in the world who had always looked up to him, who had always believed in him, and now, in this moment, he felt like he had failed her more than he had ever failed anyone. I'm sorry, Emily, he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. I don't know what came over me. I was angry. I was frustrated. And I just didn't think. I didn't stop to think about what I was doing. His words sounded weak even to him. They felt hollow, like he was trying to make excuses instead of facing the reality of what he had done. Emily's eyes softened just a little, but she didn't let him off the hook. I know you're sorry, but sorry isn't enough this time, Dad. You need to understand why this was so wrong. It's not just about a phone call to the police. It's about the message it sends. It's about the fact that you saw those kids as a threat just because of the way they looked, just because of where they were. That's what needs to change. Mr. Anderson sat there silently, taking in everything she said. He had always prided himself on being a reasonable man, someone who took the time to think things through, but in that moment, he realized how quickly his assumptions had clouded his judgment. The kids had done nothing wrong. They hadn't asked for trouble. They hadn't deserved to be treated like that, and yet he had allowed his own biases and frustration to shape his actions. Emily leaned back in her chair, her eyes searching his face as if waiting for him to truly get it. I want you to understand what you've done, not just to those kids, but to me too. I don't want to just hear words, Dad. I want to see change. I need to know that you're willing to face the truth, not just about them, but about yourself. The weight of her words landed on him with crushing force. He had always been the kind of man who tried to avoid confrontation, who hid behind his pride and his sense of security, but now that wall was gone, and he was left exposed, all he could do was sit there, staring at the table, knowing that he had to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how painful they might be. Emily stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. She didn't say anything more, but the look on her face was clear. She was done talking for now. She had said what needed to be said, and as she walked out of the room, Mr. Anderson sat there alone once again, feeling the full weight of what he had done. He had lost something today, something important, and no amount of apologies or excuses would ever bring it back. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Mr. Anderson couldn't bring himself to do much of anything. He barely touched his dinner, his mind still spinning from the conversation with Emily. Every time he tried to focus on something, anything, his thoughts would circle back to those kids. The way they had looked at the officers, confused and scared, the way they must have felt when he made that call, and the way Emily had looked at him, disappointed and hurt. It all felt like a weight he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. He sat on his porch later that night, the sky above him darkening as the evening slipped into night. The quiet of the neighborhood seemed almost suffocating now. He used to find comfort in this silence, in the predictable stillness of suburban life, but tonight it felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. He thought about how things had been before, how he had built his life on a foundation of being respectable and proper, how he had kept his distance from anything or anyone that threatened his sense of control. But now, that image of himself was shattered, and for the first time, he saw just how hollow that facade had been. What kind of man had he become, really? He had spent years hiding behind his bitterness, behind his assumptions about others. It had been easier that way. Easier to blame the world for his problems than to face the uncomfortable truths about himself. But now, everything felt different. He could no longer ignore what he had done. He couldn't run from it. He had been forced to confront his own prejudice, his own mistakes, and it was worse than he had ever imagined. As the night grew darker, Mr. Anderson heard the faint sound of footsteps coming down the street. A group of kids laughing, walking home after a long day. They were the same kids he had called the police on just hours earlier. They walked past his house, unaware of the man sitting on the porch who had made their afternoon so much harder. They were still laughing, still joking around like nothing had happened. It was almost as if the entire situation had been erased from their minds. But for Mr. Anderson, it wasn't that easy. He couldn't just let it go. He had to make things right somehow. The problem was he had no idea how. How do you fix something like this? How do you make amends for the harm you've caused, especially when that harm has touched people you barely know? He could apologize to the kids, but what good would that do? The damage had already been done. He had already judged them without even knowing them. He had already treated them as less than human, simply because of their appearance. He could apologize to the kids, but what good would that do? The damage had already been done. He had already judged them without even knowing them. He had already treated them as less than human, simply because of their appearance. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Emily's car pulling into the driveway. She had come back, but this time it was different. There was no anger in her eyes, no disappointment. She was calm, perhaps too calm. When she walked up to the porch, she didn't speak right away. She just stood there for a moment, watching him. Mr. Anderson looked up at her, unsure of what to expect. "Dad," she said, her voice softer now, but still serious. "I need you to understand something. You don't fix this with words. Words won't just apologize and expect everything to be okay. What you did today wasn't just a mistake. It's a reflection of how deep these issues go. But you can make a choice. You can choose to change. You can choose to learn, and that's the only way this will ever get better." Her words stung, but were true. He had been living his life a certain way for so long, stuck in his own narrow view of the world. It had been easy to blame others, to see the world in black and white, but now the world felt much more complicated, and he realized he had been blind to it for far too long. He didn't know how to change, he didn't know where to start, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had to try. Emily looked at him one last time, then turned to walk inside. But before she disappeared into the house, she stopped and said, "I'm not going to give up on you, Dad. But you have to do the work. You have to do better." With that, she was gone. Mr. Anderson sat there in the darkness, the weight of her words settling over him. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know if he ever would, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep going the way he had been. Something had to change, and for the first time, he realized that change had to start with him. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty and reflection. Mr. Anderson went through the motions of his daily routine, but everything felt different now. The quiet of the neighborhood no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a reminder of his failures. Every time he saw a group of kids laughing on the street or heard the sound of a basketball bouncing, his mind would flash back to that afternoon, back to the moment he called the police. He couldn't escape it, no matter how hard he tried to move on. It kept pulling him back, and in the silence of his own home, the weight of what he had done seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Emily had gone back to her work, and though she was calm with him, it was clear that things had changed between them. There was a distance now, a gap that hadn't been there before. She was still willing to talk to him, still trying to guide him, but he knew she wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. She wasn't angry anymore, but the hurt was still there, lingering in her words and her eyes. Mr. Anderson realized that the trust he had taken for granted had been shaken, and it wasn't something he could fix overnight. He had thought at first that maybe time would heal things. Maybe if he just laid low and kept his head down, it would all blow over. But he quickly realized that wasn't going to work. The damage he had caused wasn't something that could be erased with silence. He needed to do something that would show he was serious about changing, about making amends. But how could he possibly make up for the harm he had caused? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just about fixing things with Emily or the kids. It was about fixing something deeper inside himself. He had spent so many years avoiding uncomfortable truths, ignoring his own biases, that he had never truly looked at the world around him. He had never questioned the assumptions he had been carrying, the way he had viewed people based on superficial things like race, class, and appearance. It was easier to judge from a distance than to face the reality of the world. One evening, a week after the incident, Mr. Anderson made a decision. He was going to start by confronting his own ignorance. It wouldn't be easy, but he had to try. He had to face the people he had wronged, starting with the kids. The next morning, he walked across the street to the basketball court. It felt awkward, as though he were stepping into a world he had no business being in, but he kept walking, determined. When he reached the court, the kids were there again, playing just like before. Their laughter filled the air, but there was an edge to it now, something different. They saw him approaching, and for a moment, they all stopped. Their eyes were wary. Mr. Anderson took a deep breath. This was it. He had no idea how they would react, but he had to try. He had to own up to what he had done. "Hey," he called out, his voice a little shaky, but steady enough. "Can I talk to you all for a minute?" The kids exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of him. He was the man who had called the cops on them just days earlier. He was the one who had treated them like criminals for no reason. But they stayed quiet, watching him closely. "I'm really sorry for what happened the other day," Mr. Anderson began, feeling the weight of every word. "I made a mistake. I judged you all unfairly. I called the police on you, and that was wrong. I want to apologize for putting you in that situation. You didn't deserve it, and I'm sorry for making you feel like you didn't belong here." The kids were silent for a moment, processing his words. Mr. Anderson wasn't sure if they believed him or if they even wanted to hear it, but he kept going, speaking from the heart. "I know I can't take back what I did, and I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. But I want to do better. I want to change, and I want to show you that I can. I don't expect anything from you, but I hope you know I'm truly sorry." The kids stood there, still unsure of what to make of this apology. But then one of them, a boy no older than 11, stepped forward. He had a serious look on his face, but there was something in his eyes that softened as he spoke. "We don't really know why you did what you did," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "But we're glad you said sorry. It was really messed up what happened, but thanks for saying it. It means something." The boy hesitated, then added, "It means something." Mr. Anderson nodded, his heart heavy with the understanding that this was just the beginning. The road to redemption wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be quick, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. As he turned to walk back to his house, he didn't feel the weight of shame pressing on him as much as before. It was still there, of course, but now there was also a glimmer of hope. Hope that somehow he could make things right one step at a time. As Mr. Anderson walked back to his house, the weight in his chest had lessened, but hadn't disappeared. The apology to the kids, though small, had been a step forward, but he knew it wasn't enough. It couldn't be. He had to prove to them and to himself that he was committed to change. The kids had accepted his apology, but there was still a lingering distrust in their eyes. They didn't know him, not really, and they had every right to be skeptical. One apology didn't erase what had happened. Back in his living room, Mr. Anderson sat down in front of the television, but he wasn't watching it. His mind was racing. He thought about the kids again, their faces, their expressions. He thought about Emily and how she had looked at him the other night, disappointed but still hopeful. He had a long road ahead of him, and he knew it. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could start making changes, starting with himself. The next morning, he found himself at the local library. It felt like an odd thing for him to do. He wasn't much of a reader, and he hadn't stepped into the library in years, but it felt like the right place to start. He needed to learn. He needed to understand more about the world beyond his narrow perspective, and if he wanted to prove to Emily, to the kids, and to himself that he was capable of change, it had to start with education. He spent hours there, reading books on race, bias, and social justice. He picked up articles about systemic inequality, about the experiences of people who didn't look like him, about the way society had created divides that weren't always visible on the surface. He felt uncomfortable at first, reading about things he had never really thought about. It was easier to remain ignorant, to live in a world where everything made sense to him. But the more he read, the more he began to see the cracks in his own thinking. The more he understood how his own prejudices had shaped the way he saw others and the way he had treated them. By the end of the week, Mr. Anderson had read several books and attended a community discussion about racial equality. It was uncomfortable for him to be in a room full of people who were so open about their struggles, about the injustices they had faced, but he stayed. He listened, and for the first time, he felt a real sense of guilt for his own ignorance. It wasn't enough to just apologize. He had to take action. He had to do the work. By the end of the week, Mr. Anderson had read several books and attended a community discussion about racial equality. It was uncomfortable for him to be in a room full of people who were so open about their struggles, about the injustices they had faced, but he stayed. He listened, and for the first time, he felt a real sense of guilt for his own ignorance. It wasn't enough to just apologize. He had to take action. He had to do the work. Emily noticed the change in him. It wasn't immediate, but over time, she saw him making a genuine effort to understand. He started talking about the books he had read, about the things he was learning. She could tell he wasn't just going through the motions. He had changed. He wasn't the same man who had called the police on those kids. One evening, as they were sitting together at the kitchen table, Emily spoke up. "You've been doing the work, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. Mr. Anderson nodded a little sheepishly. "Yeah, I have. It's not easy, but I want to understand. I want to do better. I need to." Emily didn't say anything at first. She just sat there watching him for a long moment. Then she smiled. A small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I can see that it's not easy, but you're doing it, and that's what matters." The conversation was a turning point for Mr. Anderson. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of his efforts. It was a sign that Emily could begin to trust him again. She believed he was trying to make real change. More than that, it was a reminder that change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, and it takes time. That night, as he sat alone in his living room, Mr. Anderson thought about everything he had learned in the past week. He thought about the kids, about how they had reacted to his apology, how they hadn't held it against him, but had still left a piece of doubt in his mind. They had no reason to trust him yet, but he was determined to prove to them that he was serious. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could influence the future, and he was ready to do whatever it took to rebuild the trust he had broken. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time, Mr. Anderson felt like he was on the right path. That was enough to keep him moving forward. Weeks passed, and Mr. Anderson continued his quiet journey of self-reflection and change. He wasn't the type to broadcast his efforts, but every day he made small decisions that reinforced his commitment to being a better person. Someone who didn't just talk about equality, but practiced it. He spent more time in the community, attending local events, speaking with his neighbors, and getting to know people he had once ignored. He volunteered at a local youth center, offering to help with their after-school programs, doing his part to ensure that kids from all backgrounds felt welcomed and supported. It wasn't easy. There were moments when old habits crept in, when he felt frustrated with the pace of change, when he wanted to retreat back into his comfort zone. But he didn't. He pushed through, reminded by the faces of those kids, by the look in Emily's eyes when she saw him trying. With each new step, he felt a little lighter, as if the burden of guilt was slowly being replaced with something else, something more hopeful. One afternoon, as Mr. Anderson walked home from a community meeting, he saw the kids again. They were playing basketball on the same court, just as they had been that day weeks ago when everything had started. They were laughing and shouting, their energy filling the air. It struck him how little had changed for them. They were still out there doing what kids do best, playing, enjoying life, not weighed down by the things that had weighed him down. He stopped at the edge of the court and watched them for a moment. He wasn't sure if he was ready to approach them again. Not yet anyway. But he knew he couldn't stay on the sidelines forever. A few of the kids noticed him standing there, and for a second, they stopped. There was a brief pause, a moment of hesitation. Then one of the boys, one of the kids who had spoken up when he'd apologized, motioned for him to come over. "Hey, Mr. Anderson," the boy called out, his voice friendly but cautious. "You gonna join us for a game, or what?" Mr. Anderson's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected them to call him over, hadn't expected them to remember him. But here they were, extending a small gesture of kindness, offering him a place in their world, despite everything that had happened. He took a deep breath and walked toward them. As he stepped onto the court, one of the kids tossed him the ball. He caught it, feeling the smooth surface in his hands, a simple reminder of how far he had come since that fateful day. The kids gathered around, joking about who would win, about how bad they were at making layups, about how Mr. Anderson probably couldn't keep up. It was all in good fun, and for the first time, Mr. Anderson felt like he truly belonged, not because he had apologized or because he had done the right thing, but because he was being accepted, being included by the very people he had once wronged. They played for a while, laughing together. Mr. Anderson wasn't the best on the court. He wasn't even close, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was there. He was part of something now, not just an observer on the sidelines. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, one of the kids, another boy who had been quiet the whole time, looked up at him and said, "You know, you're all right, Mr. Anderson. You might not be the best at basketball, but you're cool." The words, simple as they were, meant more than anything Mr. Anderson had expected. They were a sign that he was starting to repair the damage he had caused. He smiled a real smile this time and nodded, "Thanks, kid. I'm just trying to keep up with you all." As the game wound down and the sun began to set, the kids grabbed their things and started to head home. Mr. Anderson stayed behind for a moment, watching them go. For the first time, he didn't feel the guilt or shame that had followed him for so long. He had made mistakes, big ones, but in that moment he realized that it wasn't about erasing those mistakes. It was about making things right one step at a time. Emily had been right all along. Change didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always easy, but it was possible, and more importantly, it was worth it. As he walked back to his house, Mr. Anderson knew that this wasn't the end of his journey. It was just another step. There would be more work to do, more moments of discomfort, more times when he would have to challenge his own thinking. But for the first time, he felt ready. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was the only path worth taking. And as he walked, he felt a quiet sense of hope for the future, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was finally becoming the man he had always hoped he could be. The weeks continued to unfold, and with each passing day, Mr. Anderson found himself more immersed in the community than he had ever been before. He was no longer just a distant neighbor, someone who kept to himself and barely interacted with others. He had become a fixture in the local youth center, volunteering his time to help out with the kids. Whether it was coaching basketball, setting up activities, or simply offering a listening ear when they needed someone to talk to, it wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful. Every day, he could see the difference it was making, not just in the kids' lives, but in his own as well. One evening, as he was helping clean up after a basketball game at the center, Emily stopped by to visit. She hadn't been to the youth center much herself, but tonight, she came to check in on how things were going. She watched quietly as Mr. Anderson interacted with the kids, giving high fives, encouraging them to keep practicing, and even laughing at a few of their jokes. There was no tension between them now, no awkwardness. Just a sense of mutual respect that had grown over time. After the game, Emily waited for him by the entrance. He hadn't noticed her at first, but when he saw her standing there, he wiped his hands on his pants and walked over. "You're looking different," she said with a small smile, her voice teasing but also kind. "I almost didn't recognize you." Mr. Anderson smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Yeah, I've been doing a lot of work lately," he said, his tone modest but proud. "More than I expected. Honestly, but it feels good. It feels right." Emily nodded, watching him carefully. She had seen the transformation in him over the past few months. The way he'd started engaging more with the people around him, how he no longer shied away from difficult conversations, how he was actively trying to undo the damage he'd caused. She had watched him grow, not just as a father, but as a man. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of discomfort, but the change was undeniable. "You're doing good, Dad," she said quietly. "Really good. I know it wasn't easy for you, but I'm proud of you." Mr. Anderson's chest tightened at her words, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a lump rise in his throat. He had never been one to accept compliments easily, but hearing Emily say that, seeing the pride in her eyes, meant more than anything else he had done so far. It wasn't about his efforts being perfect. It was about the fact that he had made the effort in the first place. That in itself was enough to show her and to show himself that he was capable of real change. He cleared his throat, trying to hold back the wave of emotion. "Thanks, Emily," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." For a moment, they just stood there, the noise of the kids in the background fading into the distance as they shared a quiet, meaningful moment. It was a moment of understanding, a moment of healing. He still had work to do. He knew that, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was doing it alone. The next day, after a long shift at the youth center, Mr. Anderson decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. It had become one of his favorite activities, a way to clear his head and think. As he walked past familiar houses, he noticed how much the neighborhood had changed for him. Not just in the way he interacted with people, but in how he saw them. Before, he had always been so quick to judge, so eager to keep a safe distance from others, thinking that if he kept his head down, everything would be fine. But now he saw people for who they really were. Not just neighbors, but individuals with stories, struggles, and dreams just like him. He passed by the basketball court where the kids often played, and for a brief moment he stopped. He watched them again, the same group of kids he had apologized to weeks ago. They were playing a pickup game, laughing and shouting as they always did. But now, he saw something else in their actions, something that hadn't been there before. They weren't just playing a game. They were showing each other respect, helping one another improve, lifting each other up. He watched them again, the same group of kids he had apologized to weeks ago. They were playing a pickup game, laughing and shouting as they always did. But now he saw something else in their actions, something that hadn't been there before. They weren't just playing a game. They were showing each other respect, helping one another improve, lifting each other up. In that moment, Mr. Anderson realized something important. The kids weren't just teaching him how to be better. They were showing him the way to true community. It wasn't about grand gestures or big speeches. It was about showing up, being present, listening, and learning. It was about understanding that everyone, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like, deserved to be treated with dignity. As he turned to continue his walk, Mr. Anderson felt something shift inside of him again. It was the quiet realization that he wasn't just doing this for the kids or Emily. He was doing it for himself too. He had spent so much of his life carrying around judgments and fears, but now he was learning how to let go of those burdens. He didn't know where the road ahead would take him, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. As the weeks turned into months, Mr. Anderson found himself more deeply entrenched in his community than he had ever been before. He continued volunteering at the youth center, offering not just his time, but his heart. It became clear to everyone around him that he wasn't the same person who had made that fateful call to the police all those months ago. He had grown not just in his actions, but in the way he saw the world and the people around him. One evening, as he was leaving the youth center after a particularly uplifting conversation with a group of teenagers, he was stopped by one of the parents who had been at the community meeting months ago. She was a woman he had never spoken to much before, but she had been one of the first to offer him a genuine thank you after his speech. "Mr. Anderson," she called out, her voice warm and appreciative. "I just wanted to thank you again for everything you've done, not just for the kids, but for all of us. You've really changed things around here." Mr. Anderson smiled, grateful, but a little humble. "I've just been doing my part," he said. "There's still a lot of work to do, but I'm happy to be a part of it." The woman shook her head. "It's more than that. You've inspired people. You've shown us that change is possible, and that's more than just doing your part." He felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't just about his actions anymore. It was about the ripple effect he had created. The way his own journey had inspired others to look at themselves and ask, "How can I be better?" As he walked back home that evening, he thought about how much he had learned in such a short time. He had come so far from the man who had once judged others and distanced himself from his community. He had learned that true strength didn't come from isolating yourself or building walls around your heart. It came from reaching out, admitting when you were wrong, and taking the difficult steps toward becoming better, not just for yourself, but for the people around you. When he got home, Emily was sitting on the porch waiting for him. She looked up when he walked in, a smile spreading across her face. "Dad," she said, her voice soft, "I'm really proud of you." Mr. Anderson sat down next to her, the cool evening breeze wrapping around them. "I'm proud of you too, Emily. You were the one who showed me that change was possible. I owe all of this to you." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with affection. "You did the work, Dad. You showed me that you were willing to do whatever it took to become the man you wanted to be, and that's all anyone can ask for." They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of the day slowly lifting as they both reflected on the journey they had been through together. There was still work to do, still lessons to learn. But for the first time, Mr. Anderson felt at peace with who he had become. He wasn't perfect, and he never would be, but he was trying, and that was enough. As the stars began to appear in the sky above, Mr. Anderson realized that he was no longer defined by his mistakes. He had built a new life, one based on growth, on community, and on understanding. And as he sat next to Emily, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everything that had brought him to this moment. The future was still unknown, but for the first time in years, he was ready to face it with hope, with determination, and with the knowledge that change, no matter how hard, was always possible. If you enjoyed this video, Mr. Anderson said, his voice carrying a hint of the journey he had been on, don't forget to hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. All of this is just the beginning. This ending leaves the audience intrigued and eager for more, while also encouraging them to engage with the content and share it with others.